Good evening, and welcome to the Museum at MFIT's Fashion Culture Series. Tonight we are joined by Elspeth Brown, Associate Professor of History at the University of Toronto. Elspeth will present her book Work, A Queer History of Modeling, an out-of-the-ordinary history of 20th century American culture and capitalism. After the presentation, there will be a short Q&A session. Please write your questions on the index cards provided at check-in, and towards the end of the presentation, we'll come around to collect them. After the Q&A, there'll be a book signing with the author upstairs. Now, if you will please join me in welcoming Elspeth Brown.
Hello. I just went to a musical, and so I may burst out into song, but I hope I won't do that just for your sake. So thank you very much. I am thrilled to be here. Thank you to Tanya and to Melissa and to Faith and to Felix for all of your help in making this presentation possible. And I would like to start with a story of one model that illustrates some of the book's central themes. And that model is Tracy Gale Norman, who we see here. She was one of the early 1970s most successful models. She had been discovered by Irving Penn. Clairol was one of Norman's most loyal clients. And here you can see her subdued makeup and softly coiffed hair connote the kind of natural beauty, elegance, and Black respectability, which was really central to the product's marketing campaign during a period of Black nationalism and their radical critique that was central for implied middle-class audiences through this area. Clairol's basically trying to create a kind of Black respectability in relationship to this middle-class audience. During the period that Norman modeled for Clairol, dark auburn, which is based on Norman's hair color, was one of the company's strongest selling products in the Born Beautiful line, which was Clairol's African-American hair care products category. However, despite her success, her modeling career came to an abrupt end during a holiday shoot for Essence magazine. On set, Norman became aware that the assistant hairstylist in Essence fashion and the assistant hairstylist and Essence fashion director, Susan Taylor, were deep in conversation. Norman lost her concentration as the set became suffused with what she described as negative energy. She worried that her world would, in her words, come crashing down. And she was right. Norman is trans, was stealth at the time, and she was about to be outed. Now, Norman had grown up in Newark, New Jersey as a young gay man, and by her teenage years, she was both transitioning and she was also immersed in Harlem's gay ball house culture, where she learned to walk the runway, a training central to her later success as a model. And this is a world that was so memorably documented by filmmaker Jenny Livingston in her award-winning documentary, Paris is Burning, and is now being reinterpreted on Ryan Murphy's Pose, and it emerged in the 1960s as Black and Latino gay men and trans women developed their own culture of fashion fabulousness, independent of the mostly white gay balls that had been part of New York's scene since the 1930s. While on this Essence photography shoot, an assistant recognized Norman as someone he had known as a boy in Newark and outed Norman. The photographs from that shoot were never published. She was dropped by her agent and also by Clairol, and her modeling career came to an end. And like so many Black models before her, she moved to Paris, where she briefly found work as a showroom model for Balenciaga. Now, while Norman's story as the U.S. industry's first known trans model is unique, her role in lending her elegance and beauty to a consumer product is not. Today, models are a ubiquitous figure in 20th century commercial and popular culture, but this has not always been the case, and their emerging centrality to strategies of capitalist enticement has a history that began in the early 20th century, and that's one of the things that I am trying to take a look at in this book. So my book is entitled Work, A Queer History of Modeling. And it traces a history of modeling from World War I era through the 1980s, the early 1980s, around the rise of the supermodel. And what I'd like to do today is first I'd like to sketch out a few of the themes of the book. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to have in the background, a slideshow going of some of the book's images, just to give you a sense of the kinds of images I'm looking at in the project overall. And then I'd like to do 2 short readings from the book organized around specific model, photographer, designer triads, just to give you a sense of some of the kind of work that I'm doing in the project overall. So first, in terms of looking at the themes, one of them is looking at modeling as a type of work. I'm really interested in the type of labor history that very few historians write about, which is what scholars call affective labor, or the body's ability to create feeling states in other people. The modeling profession emerged in the early 20th century as merchandisers and psychologists began to sell not only the product, but also the ineffable affective benefit that the product promised, whether, for example, romance or sexual appeal or glamour or simply pleasure. Sales of all sorts of goods unfold within an affective circuit linking the manufacturer, the model, and consumer. As one commercial photographer bluntly noted of the model's labor in 1930, quote, "She sells stuff by making it desirable." So modeling is a form of labor where the model transforms subjective aspects of selfhood, whether gesture, appearance, and presence, into surplus value for consumer goods. And through the medium of their bodies, models co-produce public feelings that are tied directly to the market. A second theme I explore is the relationship of modeling to the history of sexuality. While most U.S. historians of sexuality have focused on the social movement history, in this book I'm interested more in tracing a new type of public managed commercial sexuality that is indebted to the market. And this is the sexuality of the sort of like the it girl or the X factor. It's a modern commercialized form of sexualized appeal. And one of the book's major themes is how the model as a figure moved from a cultural figure akin to a prostitute to one whose sexuality became tamed and channeled and packaged and racialized as a key ingredient to commercial marketing. And finally, it's a book, it's a queer history in a few different senses of the word. One is the older use of queer, as in peculiar or odd, and I would say the book is a bit queer in this sense because it really doesn't follow a normative narrative history. For example, I explore both fashion modeling and print modeling, crossing the boundaries between editorial and commercial work. And second, this book is a queer history in the spirit of scholars such as Kathy Cohen, who have taken an intersectional approach in their critique to early queer theory's investment in whiteness, while bringing together race and sexuality and arguing for a definition of queer that creates an oppositional space in relationship to dominant norms. And over the course of this book, I pursue an analytic focus on sexuality in the public sphere that foregrounds race along other vectors of difference. And finally, the book is a queer history in the sense that it also includes a partial history of sexual and gender minorities within the industry. So in the interwar years, queer was a derogatory term for gay men who performed a highly visible, flamboyant effeminacy. And some of the historical figures I discuss in this book were certainly very queer in this sense. And since the 1990s, queer has emerged as a term that references non-normative sexuality and that critiques stable identity formation such as gay or lesbian or straight and so on. And at times I use the word queer as, in this sense, as a shorthand for the sexually non-normative in the book overall. And the term work in the book has two references. One, it's a reminder to historians that historians of capitalism, which is one of my academic fields, that work has always unfolded outside of sites of industrial production. And it's always gendered, it's always racialized. And this process of transforming goods into commodities or shifting use value into exchange value has its own labor force in which models play a key, although pretty much unacknowledged role. At the same time, work is also work, as in W-E-R-K. It's the queer racialized performativity of the sachet, the strut, and the stroll. And this is the work of work it, which is to say the models walk on the runway, or to reach back still further in time, the streetwalker's seductive display of her wares. And this bodily performance of spectacular femininity produces an effective excess that I argue throughout the book offers possibilities for both capitalist dream worlds and for queer world-making. Work, then, as a term, references both the effective labor central to the production of surplus value and at the same time an excessiveness of often racialized queer performativity. So those are pretty much some of the themes that I'm trying to look at in the project overall. And what I'd like to do now is kind of dip into some of the readings that I do of some of the materials that I'm looking at, using specific collaborations between models, photographers, and designers as kind of models of the guides to social and political worlds in which they worked. So I'd like to start with the World War I era with three figures who are really quite key to the history of fashion photography. One is Baron de Meyer, the very queer father of modern fashion photography. His model collaborator Dolores, who was arguably the most well-known model of the World War I years. And finally, the couturier whose design she wore, which was Lady Duff Gordon, also known as Lucille, whose scrapbooks are here in FIT special collections, in which I had an opportunity to consult for this project. And I can't believe the timing of the slides. Can I just say, it worked out perfectly. So this is Terry Toy, who was the first out trans model who was, yeah, except it's going now, so I hope it stops. If it doesn't, we'll go back. Maybe because I just touched it. Okay, so this is Baron de Meyer in the center image, Lady Duff Gordon, also known as Lucille, on the top right, and Dolores, the model that I'll be talking about. So the high-end couturier model was really a very little-known figure in the US until about 1909, when Lady Duff Gordon sent 4 of her London-based mannequins to the United States to help open her New York branch of Lucille Limited. Now, Duff Gordon was the first designer in the US or the UK to display her clothing designs on living models rather than on sawdust dummies, and she was also the first to choreograph her mannequins' movements for public display. And at the time, the word used generally was mannequin as opposed to model. Drawing on her earlier work in the theater, she understood that movement was central to viewers' emotional connection to dress, and that they needed to see how the fabric moved and performed in relationship to the wearer's every motion, so that in order for the buyer to potentially imagine herself being the gown's owner. So viewing a custom-made gown became a type of performance in which clients became cast members with living models as theatrical talent and Duff Gordon as the producer, director, and choreographer. And this is one of her early mannequin parades in London. So in an era when dressmakers described their clothing basically numerically, like a model of clothing was the number 4 or the number 16 or what have you, Duff Gordon began to describe her clothes through basically harnessing the viewer's fantasies by naming her dresses as well as the mannequins who wore them. So she described her gowns or dresses as gowns of emotion, and each example was individually named and given a description that identified the emotional state that the colors, fabric, and cut were meant to evoke. So, for example, she named a dress of soft gray chiffon veiling an underdress of pink and violet taffeta, the sighing sounds of lips unsatisfied. And some of the gown names connoted a kind of more exotic, sapphic sexuality, as in the 1916-1917 Oriental evening gown, Oriental in quotes, of course, Bilitis, which was Sappho's fictional contemporary. So to showcase these emotional gowns, Duff Gordon staged these elaborate fashion spectacles in her various showrooms, which were located eventually not only in New York and London, but also in Paris and Chicago. And she commissioned her sister, who was Eleanor Glynn, who also became later a Hollywood screenwriter, as well as the originator of the term it to describe modern celebrity, she commissioned Eleanor, her sister, to write texts for these fashion events that were basically a combination of tableau vivant, the stage play, and the fashion show. And Lucille's designs, her willingness to upend Victorian mores, and her modern aesthetic proved very wildly popular, and her list of clients became even more numerous and elite. However, she was really bad at business, and she kind of went out of business by 1915. And so what she ended up doing was basically selling her costumes and the decor to Florence Ziegfeld, who also insisted on hiring 4 of Lucille's models as well. And these models became the first showgirls on the Broadway stage. Up to this point, basically, the type of person known as a showgirl did not exist. And in fact, the showgirl represents somebody who's parading clothes on Broadway for purchase in some of these couture salons. So one of these one of these models, of course, was Dolores, who we see here. Lucille herself accepted the opportunity to design costumes for Florence Ziegfeld, which she did through 1922. And this was one of the ways in which people in New York in the time period got to understand and learn about a fashion model who, up to this point, had been pretty much more of an elite figure. So Dolores was one of the era's most well-known models. She was British-born. She was a dressmaker's model who moved from Lucille's New York salon to the Broadway stage in June 1917, when she began performing in both the Ziegfeld Follies and in the after-hours show, The Midnight Frolic. She was born Kathleen Mary Rose, and she was tall, nearly 6 feet. She was working class with a Cockney accent, had blue eyes and ash blonde hair, and apparently Lady Duff Gordon, or Lucille, reportedly discovered her working as an errand girl in her London showroom. And Duff Gordon spent a year on her new creation, Dolores, renaming her, eradicating her working class accent, teaching her the confidence and poise and walking techniques that became central to Duff Gordon's mannequin parades. And also Dolores worked closely with the photographer who transformed how models and couture were represented on the magazine page. And this is Condé Nast's first paid staff photographer, the very queer Baron Adolphe de Meyer. Condé Nast had bought Vogue magazine in 1909, and there had been other photographers, but they weren't necessarily on staff, and their aesthetic is quite different from de Meyer's. So de Meyer's virtuosity with the camera, which was drawn from his work within the fine art movement and photography, successfully convinced fashion magazine editors that photography, rather than pen and ink illustrations, could activate viewers' affective engagement. And with the shift to photography to describe couture, the high-end fashion magazine set the stage for a new profession to become ubiquitous after the war, which was the fashion model. Between 1903 and 1913, when Vogue published his first society portrait, de Meyer developed an aesthetic approach that transformed fashion photography. As with other pictorialists, he focused on light, tonal gradations, and differential focus as a means of conveying the emotional tone of the aesthetic photograph. He pioneered the use of artificial light, employing floodlights and reflectors and mirrors in the low flash as techniques for achieving his atmospheric interior portraits and still life studies. Eventually, to intensify the luminosity of his images still further, he stretched lace across his lens in the effort to disrupt the indexicality of the camera. And through these pictorialist techniques, de Meyer pushed the camera image towards the connotative meanings of the aesthetic movement in photography, which is to say beauty and metaphor, symbolism, and emotional intensity. And these techniques of producing aesthetic feeling became centrally important to fashion photography at Vogue after 1913. So de Meyer brought to Vogue a specific Edwardian structure of feeling defined by a revolt against the rationality of the Second Industrial Revolution, as well as an oppositional celebration of aesthetic feeling. Raymond Williams used the term structure of feeling in an effort to link a culture's documentary expressions, quote, from poems to buildings to dress fashions, as he wrote, to, quote, all the elements in the general organization of what he described as a culture's whole way of life. So pictorialist photography joined with other cultural documents, including Debussy's music or Nijinsky's dancing or Whistler's painting, to create an oppositional culture that valorized feeling and emotion over rationality and system, which had been the era's dominant culture. But there's another aspect of this transatlantic aesthetic culture that informed de Meyer's work, its queerness. Borrowing from Williams once again, this culture's documentary expressions, and here we might think of Beardsley's drawings or F. Hollanday's photographs, are constituent of a whole way of queer life for a transatlantic counterculture that saw its aesthetic vocabulary and emphasis on feeling emerge as a dominant cultural formation during the Edwardian era before becoming a residual formation during the post-World War I modernist period. So de Meyer was at the center of these queer cosmopolitan circles on both sides of the Atlantic, and his aesthetic contributions played an important role in the transition of modernism in American fashion photography. He was worldly, cultured, multilingual, and was part of the effeminate gay aesthetic circle in New York that included figures like Carl Van Vechten and other creative artists. Florine Stettheimer painted her friend de Meyer in 1923 as an effeminate deity figure standing in front of his camera and tripod, draped with the lace through which de Meyer made many of his images. De Meyer gazes to one side, his lips delicately pursed, his arms girlishly akimbo on his slender yet accentuated hips. De Meyer also wrote articles on decoration and entertaining, accompanied by his own table settings and flower arrangements, which he also photographed for Vogue. So his excessive aesthetic, if you will, can be seen in the profusion of objects and textures and fabrics and flowers that give his work its signature style. In these technically brilliant images, de Meyer lovingly delineates each flower petal, bridal jewel, and trailing ribbon. His work is exceptional in large part because of his success in using his innovative lighting techniques to illuminate the material objects, such as lace and crystal, that other fashion photographers had been unable to bring alive through the camera. His brilliance in animating the materiality of luxury commodity culture made his work indispensable to Nast, whose growing magazine empire depended on the support of luxury retailers such as Cartier and Tiffany. De Meyer's work with Vogue brought a queer aesthetic based on sensibility, excess, and artifice, together with the market, producing a thread of queer capitalism that has been central to fashion ever since. Now, de Meyer's affectless collaborator in some of these most spectacular fashion essays was Lucille's model, Dolores. De Meyer photographed both Lucille gowns and Dolores numerous times in this period, but I will focus just for a second here on one of the 7 pages in an April 1919 fashion essay on bridal wear. Dominating the page spread, Dolores models a platinum and diamond Mercury headdress and a gown of silver cloth. De Meyer's lighting, which is from behind the model as well as from below, as well as the Mercury wings, leads the viewer to Dolores's face, especially her piercing gaze. And here I'm looking at the spread that's on the right-hand side. So Dolores stares back at the viewer with a kind of studied affectlessness, her blank expression creating a somewhat intimidating canvas for de Meyer's accessorizing. This lack of expression was, in fact, one of Dolores's defining performances and marks not only her work for de Meyer, but also, I would suggest, became the template for fashion models more generally. In these de Meyer images, the complex history and cultural significance of racialization and class passing are condensed into her expressionless face. A working-class immigrant herself, but one who is privileged with impeccable Anglo-Saxon credentials, her performance of elite whiteness helped consolidate what Jose Munoz has called a standard national affect in the U.S., against which all other affective codes appear as over-the-top and excessive. And here, Dolores' lack of affect serves as an ideal canvas for both de Meyer's accessorizing and for the implied viewer's commodity longings. At this historical moment, this combination of de Meyer's queer pictorialist excessiveness and Dolores' laconic whiteness proved a powerful combination for Nast's elite readership. So de Meyer brought together pictorialism's aesthetic vocabulary with a queer cosmopolitan sensibility that was characterized by affective excess to create stunning fashion photographs that perfectly matched Condé Nast's needs. Unlike the flat documents of his photographic competitors, like people like Ira Hill, de Meyer's photographs sought to produce a utopian flight of aesthetic feeling that the text then tethered to a very specific outcome, which was sales. As the caption for de Meyer's portrait of Jeannie Engels notes, the arrangement, quote, of a real lace veil is one of the highest forms of art. If one craves it, and what bride wouldn't, it can be purchased for $5,000. So, I mean, this is a lot of money in 1919. De Meyer's photographs, emerging from a queer cosmopolitanism that had once privileged the aesthetic movement's art for art's sake, tied the utopian performative's desire for a better life to the accumulation of luxury goods. So that's a bit of a window into kind of World War I era material. And now what I'm going to do is kind of fast forward to the 1960s, to the last chapter of the book, in which I do a number of different things. But one of them is I look a bit more closely at the collaboration between Danielle Luna, the model, and Richard Avedon, also the designer James Galanos, a little bit. So I apologize for the kind of fast forwardness of the going all the way up to the 1960s, but bear with me. We're in 1965 now, we're not in 1919. So model Danielle Luna's historic work with Richard Avedon in 1965 broke open the high-end fashion modeling industry to black models. But it did so, and this was the issue of the magazine in which this took place, but it did so through a racial script that brought together both primitivism and modernity as the material preconditions for black participation within the industry. This 1965 Harper's issue represented U.S. fashion's recognition of the hegemony of youth culture, a development that had been ongoing in the fashion and music world in Britain for some years. And I actually realized I didn't mention this, but Avedon guest edited this particular issue of Harper's, and also worked with Martin Israel to design the entire issue as well. So it looks a bit different from the other issues on either side of it. Actually, he guest edited it with Nikki Haslam, sorry. And you can see that there was an emphasis on a kind of futurity and space as part of this issue, and it was designed to interpret American youth cultures, including black culture, for a white mainstream audience. It promised a kind of partial passport to the offbeat side of now, to quote the issue, and included a glossary of contemporary slang, much of it drawn from black culture, for example, terms such as jive and groove and bread, etc. It had a feature on op and pop fashion, a Tom Wolfe essay on the new chic, a series of Avedon portraits of models dressed as astronauts, and a model reclining on a moon beach by the Sea of Tranquility. And the avatar of British mod youth culture, Jean Shrimpton, made her U.S. fashion debut on the cover, photographed by Avedon as an astronaut wearing a pink space helmet, which we had just seen. Modern artists Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, as well as a very young Bob Dylan, have full-page portraits in the issue. And visually, the issue is a stark departure from prior issues. For example, one of the one of the differences, of course, is the use of full-page bleeds that you can see here in this particular spread, but there were other kind of aesthetic shifts that mark the issue as well. So Avedon marked his departure from past issues through his choice of models. On page 178, favorite Avedon model, China Machado, who is identified, quote, as our own China, spins skyward in Galzine pajamas, while on the opposite page, an unidentified model cavorts in Valentino. This is not what this one here. And then we see on pages 184 and 185, Danielle Luna appearing with favorite model Verushka dancing the frog. So this is remarkable because it's one of the first times that we see an African-American model on the pages of a high-end mainstream or white stream fashion magazine at all. But if Harper's editor at the time was Nancy White, she was willing to break the color line, however briefly, with Luna. And Avedon's tremendous prominence in the profession enabled him to convince Nancy White to take a risk by shooting a an African-American model for this particular issue. So she did take this risk, but several of the couture designers whose work was scheduled to appear in Harper's were not willing to take this risk. This particular issue in 1965 corresponded to when the magazine was scheduled to showcase the work of Man Boucher, the Chicago designer who had made his reputation in Paris in the interwar years. But Man Boucher had veto power over who modeled his work, and he refused to allow Danielle Luna to appear in his designs. He said, quote, "My customers come from Texas. To see a black girl in a dress that they might wear is to absolutely end the possibility of their buying the dress." So then Avedon turned to the young designer Norman Norrell, who responded, quote, "out of the question." So finally, Avedon secured James Galanos his permission to have Luna appear in his designs, and that's who we're seeing here in this page spread. But because of the racism directed towards Luna by American designers, Avedon only had Galanos's designs to work with, and to create other images, he had to have some dresses custom made for her to wear. And so he turned to Bill Blass and Pauline Trigère to make additional dresses out of this kinetic optical designed fabric that was based on the physicist Dr. Gerald Oster, whose work had recently opened at the New York's Howard Wise Gallery. And apparently he had been tripping and he saw these optical patterns and he made this fabric, and then whatever, right? It is the 1960s. So these were purpose-made dresses that Avedon basically arranged to have made so that Danielle Luna could model them in this particular issue. And of course, they did indeed look avant-garde with their bold geometric patterns and layers of stripes and lines. But at the same time, of course, there's a kind of discourse of primitivism that's also unfolding in this series of images. And Luna's placement alongside pop art and moon suits and kinetic fabric and other avatars of the now certainly situate her as an emblem of the modern and the contemporary and implicitly the future. But although Avedon's 1970s interview suggests that he sought to distance his work from Luna from what he called that noble savage business, the photographs and their captions show the persistence of the visual and material discourse of racial primitivism. In this spread, for example, Luna crouches on all fours while sheathed in James Galanos's tiger print chiffon, and on the opposite page, Luna claws at the camera while wearing Galanos's diaphanous leopard skin design, also made of silk. Animal skin fabric, posed on all fours, paw or hand raised with claws or fingers extended. These photographs make their meaning within a longer history of primitivist discourse that places black bodies closer to nature, to the wild, to a kind of timeless vitality for white audiences. And oddly, these particular Galanos animal prints are really not generally representative of his other work. and nor do they speak to the issue's overall theme, which is about, of course, futurity and the now. So this is kind of more typical of Galanos's work at the time. But even here, Luna, even in this particular spread, Luna's glamorous elegance is exoticized and racialized by the caption, which describes, quote, the tall strength and pride of movement of a Maasai warrior, Danielle Luna, gauzed in silk. Now, of course, Avedon probably did not write the caption, and it's also important, I think, that she is mentioned as a model by name, which is certainly not the case for many models, even as late as the 60s. But nonetheless, we have this discourse of racial primitivism. It's almost as if outside of animal print chiffon, Luna could only be legible to Harper's audiences via a reference to kind of a timeless Africa. Together, these photographs and captions participate both in glamour and in a longer history of representing blackness that would have been familiar to white audiences. In this one Avedon shoot of 1965, then, we can really see these twin imbricated discourses of both primitivism and modernism. Now, clothing in general is a type of material that is perhaps unparalleled in its effective claims on the human. The silk sheath, which is a kind of translucent, sheer second skin here, signals to Luna how to engage with the material, how to move her body, which gestures to deploy. And Luna is also bringing her own embodied history as a model performing with things to this particular shoot. And this somatic history comes together with Avedon's usually minimalist stage directions to script Luna's performance as she transforms a finely crafted object, here an expertly tailored silk garment, into an animated gown, rippling with vitality and coiled energy. As Robin Bernstein has argued, material culture can be, quote, a scriptive thing, which, like a play script, broadly structures performance while simultaneously allowing for resistance and unleashing original live variations that may not be individually predictable. Things invite us to move according to a particular script, she argues, not just words. Things interpolate us in specific ways, combining narrative with history and materiality to structure particular gestures and movements. And at the same time, Luna's making her own interpretive choices. She's working with her own effective engagement with the material as she dances with things, to use Bernstein's term, undoing the work of glamour as a white racial project. The dominant expectation, given the larger historical context of this particular fashion shoot, is one of racial primitivism, but Luna and Avedon, however, working together, collaborate and construct what is an oppositional black glamour. So while Galanos's animal skin prints reference a longer history of racial primitivism, as I just described, at the same time, his work and his favorite material is chiffon, and therefore chiffon, of course, as a type of silk garment, is representing the epitome of glamour for fashion audiences. Chiffon is a delicate silk weave associated with both French evening gowns and intimate wear, and knowledgeable American audiences associated the fabric with both French haute couture and the glamour that France represented for 1960s audiences. And Galanos, who was one of the 20th century's most prominent US-based designers, designed personal wardrobes for a number of 1950s stars, including black entertainers Lena Horne, Diane Carroll, Diana Ross, Dorothy Dandridge, and he eventually focused his work on California-based society women, most famously future First Lady Nancy Reagan. At age 29 in 1954, he became the youngest designer ever to receive the prestigious Coty American Fashion Critics Award. His designs were known, and still are today, for their exquisite craftsmanship with construction techniques and finishing details that met the highest standards of French couture. Galanos worked in the finest fabrics available for his luxurious evening gowns, and in particular, he preferred chiffon, which is an elegant silk weave with a soft drape, stretch, and shimmering translucence. So glamour is a key technology of capitalist modernity, an aesthetic and material context zone that dissolves boundaries between bodies, things, and markets. It is through glamour that high-end modeling work, such as that performed by Danielle Luna wearing Galanos silk, creates the conditions through which individual consumers become effectively enmeshed with aesthetics and enter the commercial dreamscape that leads to sales. As Nigel Thrift has argued, glamour is one of modern capitalism's most powerful technologies, for it joins the materiality of objects with the effective potentiality of aesthetics. In Thrift's view, aesthetic things such as hairstyles and designer gowns are a surplus to the human. They stimulate perception and imagination, magically affecting us, producing enjoyment, pleasure, or satisfaction. Cultural producers like Avedon and Luna produce allure within a commercial culture where the boundaries between the human and the thing are no longer distinct. In Thrift's formulation, quote, allure is largely produced by the creation of worlds in which the boundaries between alive and not alive and material and immaterial have become increasingly blurred, so that what was once considered alive can become thing-like, and what was once considered dead can now show signs of life. As a cultural producer in the glamour industry, a model such as Luna, in her person as well as in her effective labor, enlivens dead objects, imbuing them with signs of life. So Luna, as a model of color performing glamour, navigated and reworked its meanings through a form of body politics that has had lasting significance. By the end of the 60s, when Luna and Avedon began their collaboration, the imbrication of whiteness and glamour had become so intimate that it was impossible for white audiences to conceptualize black glamour in the context of white print culture. And both Luna and Avedon struggled to develop a gestural vocabulary to connote it. Avedon, for one, continued his efforts after he left Harper's for Vogue in early 1966. In his meetings with Vogue editor Diana Vreeland, Avedon requested Luna for one of his first photo shoots for his new boss, a fur feature set in northern Japan. Avedon wanted to work not only with Luna in this particular issue, but he really wanted to photograph her in haute couture, in, quote, a very European or American elegant clothes to get away from the noble savage business. In other words, Avedon and Luna were trying to de-racialize glamour as an exclusive property of whiteness. However, as the day of departure for Japan drew near, Vreeland summoned Avedon to her red office at Vogue. She flatly explained that Luna could not go on the trip, as she was, quote, no one's idea of what anybody wants to look like. She could be sitting by the side of the road in the Bahamas watching the tourists go by, she said. And Avedon, sick to his stomach by his account, exclaimed, but Diana, she's extraordinary, to which Vreeland quipped, so was King Kong. Favorite model, Verushka, went instead in this particular 26-page spread of the Great Fur Caravan, as kind of well known within the history of fashion photography. In the wake of this incident, Luna decamped to the UK, where David Bailey photographed her for the cover of British Vogue in March 1966, the first non-white model whose photograph was featured on the cover of a major fashion magazine. By April 1966, her career had taken off in Europe with a role in Fellini's Satyricon and photographs in all the major European fashion magazines. Time argued that she was, quote, unquestionably the hottest model in Europe at the moment. Sadly, however, she died of a heroin overdose in Italy in 1979 at the beginning of the industry's drug use zenith. So I began today's talk with Tracy Gale Norman, whose career was ruined when she was outed as trans over 30 years ago. When journalists Jada Ewan and Aaron Wong broke that story for The Cut in December of 2015, Clairol deftly turned the page on the company's transphobic history. The company invited the now 63-year-old Norman back as the face of Clairol's new Nice and Easy Color as Real as You Are campaign, and understandably, she accepted. Trans and queer gender nonconformity appears is the in issue for mainstream media, even while the life chances of trans women of color remain the lowest of any social group, and while state legislatures debate and pass transphobic legislation, such as North Carolina's Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act of 2016. When we think about our current moment of trans and non-binary visibility within the modeling industry, it is instructive to look back at the history of Black modeling. As FIT alumna Naomi Sims told a journalist in 1969 while describing the white fashion industry's sudden discovery of Black models in the late 60s, she said, quote, "It's in to use me, and maybe some people do it when they don't even really like me. But even if they're prejudiced, they have to be tactful if they want a good picture." Okay, so it may have been in to work with Naomi Sims in the late 60s, but if you flash forward to 2008, as probably some people here know, there wasn't a single Black model walking in any of the 100 presentations in New York's Fashion Week that year. As Constant White wrote for Ebony in 2008, quote, "It's as if a sinister velvet-gloved hand decided to tide back civil rights gains of the last 4 decades." So my point is, who knows where this new visibility of trans, queer, and non-binary models will lead? Modeling is a capitalist culture industry in which the most important focus is building brands and selling goods. If booking queer, trans, or non-binary models will build the brand, well then excellent, until the next trend captivates the interest of industry insiders. A diversity of genders, sexualities, and races on the runway or magazine page, in other words, does not necessarily translate into sustained civil rights, economic stability, or improved life chances for the larger populations that these models might represent. For that, I think we need to take our activism elsewhere, to the ballot box and to the streets. So thank you very much. Well, I've never had questions with cards, so I like this. So here's one. It says, what were some of the challenges you found when researching and writing this book? Well, I found a lot of challenges. One is I hadn't realized that there really aren't very many histories written about the modeling industry. There's some journalist accounts, like Michael Gross's work was very helpful. And there's been some recent sociological work by Elizabeth Wisinger and Ashley Mears, which is wonderful and excellent. But when I first started, there really wasn't any scholarly literature. And I kind of underestimated the research involved, because especially in the early part of the 20th century, models weren't identified by name. They went by one name, like Dolores, for example. Of course, women's names often change when they get married, so trying to track who these people were and find them as they changed over time was quite difficult. And also, I have to say, I was kind of new to doing this kind of research, and I was interested in commercial culture more broadly speaking, and so I ended up with a project that, as you can see from all the images in the very beginning, that is both editorial modeling but also commercial modeling, so people who are modeling for consumer goods as well, and that's an entirely different world, and it requires a different kind of research. So it was a bit of a challenge to kind of pursue that. But it was fun to research, I have to say. It took me to a lot of excellent archives, including here at FIT, where there's great special collections. The New York Public Library has amazing stuff at the Billy Rose Theater Collection, but also in the Schomburg. And there are some models papers, Naomi Sims papers, for example, are at the Schomburg, which was very helpful. But it was kind of spotty, archivally spotty. I used a lot of periodical literature as well. I did also do some oral history interviews with some models. But yeah, over time, I didn't start out the project thinking that I would be working on a kind of queer history. I was instead doing more of a kind of Frankfurt School kind of rationalization approach to the industry. But then I realized that it wasn't, such an analytic framework wasn't really kind of addressing the the role of models in creating and performing the work that they do. And it was also, of course, completely missing the queerness of the industry, which, as I started to research more, was completely, throughout everything that I was encountering. All right, so I think that's enough about that question. Let's see. What is my next project? Wow, that's a really good question. I've been working on this other project for a while, which is, I live in Toronto. I'm from the States, but I've been living in Toronto for the last 20 years. So I've been doing a lot of work there having to do with queer and trans oral histories. I'm doing an oral history project now with trans elders and activists who are over age 55 in the US and Canada, and basically videotaping people's oral histories and doing work out of that. So it's a kind of queer archives project. And I also did a big project having to do with queer and trans family photography, kind of really trying to think through the work that queer family photographs do in producing connections and modes of belonging for queer and trans people, most of whom are migrants to the Toronto area, very racially diverse group of folks who interviewed, and we did an exhibition and a series of public programmings. So it's a kind of a public history sort of project. And I've got some ideas in the back of my head about other projects I want to do, but I'm not quite there yet in terms of saying what they might be. But thank you for that question. All right, so let's see. This one says, of the decades you covered, what were the words used to connote non-normative sexuality, especially code words? Were there words that approximate our present conceptualization of queer? That's a really great question. I would say, okay, so some of the words that I encountered mostly had to do, mostly having to do with gay men were, for example, horticultural lads. You think about all of the pansy, for example, or also there was a lot of fake royalty names like Baron de Meyer, which is a kind of fake baron. In fact, Baron de Meyer, very interesting figure who was married in a mariage blanc. Basically, his wife was a lesbian, and they both changed their names because they went to some astrologist, and he changed his name to Gain, which is G-A-Y-N-E, which has gay in it. But it also has gain, as in like making a bunch of money. Really, you just have to wonder what this astrologist was thinking. And also there was code names around, kind of female figures like Salome, for example, Duchess this, Baron that, Baroness this. But these kinds of code names, I think, are very familiar to the world of queer history. I feel that this question has really been under-researched because we don't really have a vocabulary to describe the complex gender and sexuality of somebody like Cecil Beaton, for example, who, one might call him gay, but he was also cross-dressed a lot and was really ambivalent, ambiguous about his own sexuality, and fell in love with female kind of film stars and really complicated sexuality. And so he didn't use the word queer, but I use the word queer to describe his complex gender and sexual non-normativity. And of course, that's a bit presentist of me as a historian to do that, but I just find that there's a real lack of vocabulary because there's been a lack of historical research into how it is that what terms people are using in particular time periods, in particular places. And they are specific to time. So New York of the 1930s is not the same as San Francisco of the 1930s, for example, right? So if any of you are students who want to do research projects, might be something that might be worth looking at. Okay, I think I've actually, I guess, well, here's one. What is the most surprising piece of research you discovered? Well, I would say how unbelievably queer and gay this entire freaking industry is, for going way, way back, right? All the way back to Baron de Meyer. And of course, everybody knows this is sort of like a secret in plain sight kind of thing, right? I'm not saying anything that probably no one is surprised to learn. But I guess what's kind of interesting is that nobody's really written about it very much, and historically speaking. I mean, my book goes up to the early 1980s. So now more people are writing about people like Baron de Meyer, for example, and there was an exhibition about Horst recently. So some of this work is starting to be written about and exhibited. But like, for example, I wrote a lot about George Platt Lyne's fashion photography. And so far as I know, no one's written on George Platt Lyne's fashion photography. I mean, fashion photography in general is incredibly underwritten for a variety of different reasons that I'd be happy to talk about more. But if any of you are interested in writing more about it, I would be personally very grateful, because we need more scholarship in that area. I'm happy to take some questions from the audience if, oh, here's one up there, yeah? Mainbocher, Mainbocher. That's how I pronounce his name, but other people I've heard use the name Manbacher. I don't know, basically. It was kind of whatever. He was born in, that's the name that his professional name, but he was born in Chicago and then did work. And then the other one was Norel, yeah. And you know, it's interesting that the quotes that I have from Avedon in here come from interviews that Dune Arbus, who was quite close to Richard Avedon, did in the 1970s, which I was able to get from the Avedon Foundation. But it's a very small world, and I was asked to take out that bit about King Kong from the book, so you're not going to read it in the book from the Avedon Foundation. Perhaps we're concerned about, you know, I don't know, the small world of New York fashion. Is anyone from the Avedon Foundation here? No, that's a relief. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah, certainly. So this was a 1973 very famous fashion show that featured designers like Stephen Burrows and an all-black model cast. And it's coming in 1973, so it's a bit after people like Danielle Luna and Naomi Sims, who was modeling in the late 60s and early 70s. And it is, of course, in the context of, you know, Black is beautiful, et cetera. But it's also important, I think, because some of the movement culture that is coming out of African American dance and movement culture is very much on display in that particular fashion show in the Battle of Versailles. But it had already kind of come through in terms of fashion shows before 1973, but it was a kind of white appropriation of Black movement styles, because of course there's a long history of African American performers in Broadway and elsewhere, like teaching white performers on Broadway to perform dances like the Charleston or what have you. Or you'll have someone like Mary Quant, for example, introducing her mod designs through hot jazz music, et cetera. And she's kind of waking up the British mod culture in the 1950s by disrupting the kind of staid ballroom culture by having like her short, sassy dresses being modeled by white models who are, in fact, drawing from Black culture to do so. So for me, what's one of the most amazing things about the Versailles show is the ways in which it's not white appropriation of black cultural production, it's black cultural production. And so that is nothing new to black models and black designers, like people like Stephen Burrows, but it's new to white audiences. And so I think it's important because it's showing, it's allowing African American models and designers to showcase their own work. And so it's, it's hugely important in multiple ways. And it's representing a kind of visibility in fashion of black models and designers that had been there all along, but because of the kind of structural racism that I've been describing here, had been kind of not as visible to white audiences. Thank you for the question. Yeah, feel free, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the history of his invention of the strapless dress, which he got from Livy Home,
Mm-hmm.
who was an upper middle class Jewish lesbian jazz singer.
Wow.
So there's all this,
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
And he saw Livy Home hanging out in a jazz club. She had sort of modified, a scarf to wear as a strapless dress, but then he copied that.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I don't know a huge amount about him, but so there's obviously some story about his transition from, if he's hanging out in that scene in the 30s in Paris, which, is a very queer milieu, as you're describing, very avant-garde.
Yeah, which is when he was the Paris correspondent for American Vogue. So his job is to go into the hip
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and check out what the young cool people will wear.
Well, I guess 30 years will make perhaps a person be less willing to take risks. I don't know. And also, my evidence for this, of course, is Avedon, right? Telling Dune Arbus. I don't have a second source, so it might be one of these things that it's worth. It would be interesting to see if there's other evidence to kind of contest that, because of course, the oral histories are fabulous and wonderful, but they're always kind of partial windows into the past, because people are always constructing their own narrative, right? And Avedon's getting interviewed by Dune Arbus in the 70s, right? So of course, he's crafting his own legacy, right? And part of that legacy is about producing himself as a civil rights worker within the industry, which I think is fair, for sure. But yeah, it would be great to have other sources around that. So thank you for the question. Sure, yeah, feel free. Go ahead.
He wouldn't dress Gloria Vanderbilt when she came to his salon. So you have to sort of look at.
I see.
He rejected white women too.
Yes, yeah.
She came to the salon wearing black ties.
Uh-huh.
And the vendeuse said, I'm sorry, we can't help you because if you're wearing black ties, you haven't come back.
Wow. So, yeah. Oh, who knows? Perhaps it was related to this as well. Like, I don't know. It's interesting. Thank you. That's fabulous. All right. I enjoyed this very much. So thank you very much. And please feel free to purchase the book if you're interested.